Hey friends, we're slipping back in time to the powdered, perfumed, and frankly poisonous world of medieval beauty. A world where looking ghostly pale wasn't a health concern, it was the ultimate fashion goal. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy strange bedtime history and stories where rouge, rat poison, and religion all appear in the same sentence. Leave me a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far we've all wandered before sleep finds us. Now dim the lights, fluff the pillow, and maybe turn on that faint fan hum, because tale begins with the quiet act of a woman plucking her forehead, and ends with centuries of impossible standards carved into our skin. Welcome to the silent war women waged with mirrors, moonlight, and mercury. Let's begin. There is a quiet horror to the past, not just in the plagues and the wars and the trials by fire, but in the soft, whispered rituals that women performed in solitude behind closed doors and flickering candlelight when the rest of the world slept. It is there, in that silence, that we find the true battleground of the medieval woman. Not on horseback, not in parliament, but in the mirror. In a world that demanded moral perfection and physical flawlessness, where a woman's appearance could determine her virtue. Her marriage, her safety, and even her soul beauty became a sacred duty, and the price for that duty was often death. It is hard to overstate just how obsessed medieval society was with appearances, and not in the way we might think. This was not vanity in the modern, commercial sense. It was something darker, something tied to theology, class, medicine, and myth. A pale face was not just attractive, it was a moral statement. A high forehead did not merely suggest nobility, it was a sign of intelligence, of spiritual elevation. Red lips were not just pretty, they were dangerous, seductive, possibly sinful. Everything about the female body was charged with meaning, with fear, with control. In the medieval imagination, the ideal woman was childlike pale, plump, smooth-skinned, with a small, delicate mouth, faintly flushed cheeks, and hair like golden silk. The closer a woman could resemble a painted Virgin Mary, the better. But, unlike the Virgin, she was expected to seduce and bear children, while simultaneously remaining modest and untouched. It was an impossible paradox. And yet women tried, desperately. Let us begin with the skin. The most essential component of beauty in the Middle Ages was whiteness, not simply because it was considered attractive, but because it marked a woman as noble. Tan skin was for laborers, peasants, field hands. A pale complexion meant that a woman was kept indoors, protected, sheltered from the harshness of life. It was proof of status. And so, to achieve that impossible porcelain finish, women turned to powders. The most infamous of these was ceruse, a deadly blend of white lead and vinegar. It clung to the skin like chalk, creating a smooth, ghostly mask, and it killed slowly. Women who used ceruse often experienced muscle paralysis, tremors, and rotting skin. But the more their real faces deteriorated, the more they relied on the makeup to conceal the damage, applying more, layering deeper, until the mask became permanent. Queen Elizabeth I, long after the medieval era but still trapped in its legacy, wore ceruse daily. By her death, her face beneath it was said to be ravaged, wrinkled, ulcerated, possibly infected. She died with the mask on. Many medieval women did too. And yet, that pale face had to be flushed. Without color, one appeared dead, so rouge was applied, but never too much. A light stain on the cheeks, a pink hue on the lips, just enough to suggest innocence and vitality. Too much, and you were accused of being a courtesan or worse. Some women used crushed beetroot or wild strawberries. Others blended red ochre with animal fat to create a kind of early lipstick. In Italy, a popular recipe called for brazelwood to be boiled and strained into a rosy water. In France, women dabbed wine sediment on their lips. And in England, they favored cochineal beetle extract, the same insect used to color lipstick centuries later. The mouth itself was another battleground. A small, pursed mouth was favored, a sign of restraint, modesty, and youth. Women were taught to speak softly, to keep their lips closed in public, to avoid laughter that showed teeth. A wide mouth was vulgar. So they practiced smiling without parting their lips. They chewed parsley or cloves to keep the breath sweet, for bad breath was considered a sign of moral decay. Some even rubbed powdered chalk onto their teeth to make them appear whiter, though this often wore the enamel away. And then there was the hair. In medieval Europe, hair was both sacred and dangerous. Long hair was a symbol of youth and fertility, but also temptation. The church declared that a woman's hair was her pride, and pride was a deadly sin. Unmarried women could wear their hair loose, often adorned with ribbons or flowers. But once married, a woman was expected to cover her head at all times, either with a wimple, a veil, or a linen coif. To let one's hair flow freely as a married woman was scandalous, even punishable. Still, the ideal color remained golden. Fair hair was linked to purity, to saintliness, to ancient goddesses and the Virgin herself, but most European women were brunettes. So they turned to bleaching agents, lye soap, quicklime, vinegar, stale urine, and even onion skins. They'd apply the mixture and sit in the sun for hours, veiled in fine gauze, allowing the sun to pull the pigment from their strands. The process was slow, smelly, and painful. But the results, when successful, were divine. Blonde hair that glowed like a halo in candlelight. But to truly resemble a medieval beauty, one needed a high, smooth, rounded forehead. This was considered the seat of intelligence and grace. And so, women plucked their hairlines relentlessly. Starting at the brows, moving upward into the scalp, they used tweezers, razors, and depilatory creams made from vinegar and walnut oil to thin and eliminate any sign of a natural hairline. In some cases, they plucked so far back that the forehead stretched almost halfway up the skull. In portraits, this effect is striking, ethereal, almost alien. It was meant to give the face an egg-like shape, pure and featureless, untouchable. Eyebrows and eyelashes, too, were suspect. Thick brows were masculine. Long lashes were considered a distraction. So women plucked these as well, leaving their faces eerily bare blank canvases onto which society could project whatever it pleased. The more neutral a face, the more divine. The less human, the more holy. And holy was the goal. Because beauty in the medieval mind was not just about attractiveness, it was about the soul. A beautiful woman was believed to be morally superior, closer to God. An ugly woman, especially if she was outspoken, unmarried, or poor, was often assumed to be wicked, cursed, or a witch. And so, beauty became a kind of spiritual warfare. Women altered their bodies not just to fit in, but to be safe, to be accepted, to be protected from suspicion. Yet beneath the pursuit of purity, there throbbed a darker truth. Beauty, in its most sacred form, was a weapon. And just as it could elevate a woman to divine status, it could also mark her for ruin. For medieval nuns, the rejection of physical beauty was a form of spiritual ascension. Some saints were praised for disfiguring themselves to avoid temptation. The legendary Saint Wilgefortis was said to have prayed for facial hair, so she would be spared a forced marriage, and her prayer was answered. She grew a beard, enraging her suitor, and was ultimately crucified by her father. Other women, like St. Gibi and her fellow nuns, reportedly mutilated their faces with blades during Viking raids to avoid sexual assault, believing that losing their beauty would preserve their sanctity. It is a haunting paradox that beauty, so cherished and celebrated, was also feared. For men, it could inspire lust and madness. For women, it could invite danger or divine punishment. Entire sermons were preached on the sin of vanity. Monks wrote lengthy treatises warning against cosmetics, calling them tools of the devil. In one popular allegory, a woman who wore rouge and painted her brows was described as a vessel of demons, her beauty, a facade masking inner rot. And yet these very same critics continued to admire fair, glowing, unblemished women. The contradiction was never resolved. Women were told to be beautiful, but never too much so. To be chaste, but desirable. Pure but pleasing, it was a burden no one could win. In the courts of Europe, beauty could make or break a marriage treaty. Young noblewomen were paraded before suitors like prized livestock, examined for their skin, their teeth, their hair, their hands. A single blemish, a birthmark, a crooked nose could mean rejection, humiliation, and disgrace. Entire families depended on a daughter's ability to be beautiful. And so she would begin the process early, skin scrubbed with salt, her limbs perfumed with lavender oil, her hair braided and brushed until it glowed. Mothers passed down secret recipes, whispered remedies, ancient tricks from Greek and Arabic medicine. There was a belief, for example, that wearing pearls at night made the skin whiter, that bathing in goat's milk softened the skin, that placing rose petals in one's slippers would make the scent rise through the body, perfuming the breath. And it wasn't just the elite. Even peasants, those who couldn't afford rose oil or ceruz, found ways to imitate the trends of the wealthy. Village women used flour and clay to powder their faces, berries and crushed beetle shells to tint their lips. They plucked their brows with fish bones, rubbed lard into their hands to soften the skin. Their rituals were humbler, earthier, but no less sincere. For even at the bottom of the social ladder, a woman's beauty determined how she was treated, whether she could marry well, whether she would be respected. In every corner of medieval life, the female face became a canvas upon which society projected its values. A white face was not just noble, it was trustworthy. A red mouth was not just alluring, it was dangerous. And so women lived in constant tension, caught between expectation and risk, between the saint and the sinner, between the virgin and the whore. The tools they used, lead, lime, chalk, ash, were crude and often deadly. But the ritual itself was sacred. It was their armor, their illusion of control in a world that offered them so little. As the day ended and the world fell into darkness, she would light her candle again. She would sit before her mirror, a bowl of scented water at her side. She would remove the day's powder with a cloth soaked in vinegar, then gently pat her skin dry. In the flickering light, her face would appear ghostly, worn, but still beautiful. She would look at herself not as a woman, but as an idea. And she would wonder, just for a moment, what her life might have been if she had been born without the need to please, to perform, to paint herself into perfection. If she was too beautiful, she could be accused of vanity, of seduction, of sorcery. If she was not beautiful enough, she could be cast aside, left unmarried, vulnerable to poverty or forced religious life. Her entire fate, her social position, her security, even her afterlife hinged on appearances she could barely control. And so, with trembling hands, she powdered her face with poison and bleached her hair with fire. In many regions, especially among the nobility of France and Italy, women's beauty was so intensely politicized that entire manuals were written describing proper cosmetics, fragrances, and grooming rituals. These recipes, found in texts like the Trottola, a famous 12th century guide to women's health, offered detailed instructions: how to remove blemishes with boiled roots and egg whites, how to soften the skin with almond oil, how to plump the lips with crushed clover and goose fat. One remedy claimed to erase freckles entirely using the marrow of a pig's bone mixed with rosewater. Others advised rubbing burned cork onto the cheeks, then covering it with a layer of chalk to simulate a natural flush. It was medicine and magic, science and superstition all at once. But beyond the creams and the dyes, medieval beauty was also performance, an entire choreography of stillness, restraint, and silence. A woman was expected to move slowly, gracefully, never in haste. Her voice should be soft and measured, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered in modesty. Blinking too much, speaking too loudly, even chewing food too eagerly was considered vulgar. The beautiful woman did not simply look the part, she embodied it. She became a statue, sculpted by society's hands, trapped in a role she could never fully escape. And there were places where beauty took on even greater weight within the church itself. But not all beauty was made with pigments and powders. Some was believed to come from within, from the food a woman ate, the scents she wore, the way she moved, and even how she breathed. A beautiful queen could distract, influence, persuade. These perfumes, known as pomanders, were not just for scent, but for social armor. A foul smell could end a courtship. A single wrinkle could end a betrothal. In this world, a woman's skin was not just skin, it was currency. But it wasn't just the living who were beautified. In some noble families, even the recently deceased were powdered, painted, dressed in silk, and laid out for viewing with delicate blush applied to their cheeks. Because beauty was not only for the living, it followed women beyond the grave. A final performance for God and society alike. She could unite kingdoms with a glance. But a plain queen, no matter how wise, was often dismissed, gossiped about, feared. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was praised endlessly for her beauty, which was said to bring peace to men and stir chaos in poets. Even her political enemies acknowledged her charm, her poise, her unmatched allure. It was not just her cleverness that earned her influence, it was her face. And so, young noblewomen were trained early. By 12 or 13, they were taught to sit still for long hours, to dress with restraint, to speak only when spoken to. Their mothers taught them how to pluck hair, how to braid it in the Italian style, how to keep their breath fresh with sprigs of mint. Girls were told to avoid garlic, onions, and certain beans, which were believed to give the skin a coarse texture. Instead, they were encouraged to eat pomegranate seeds and suck on sugar cubes soaked in rose oil. Medieval thinkers believed that the body was ruled by humor's four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A balance of these fluids kept the body healthy and the skin glowing. Too much black bile, they believed, caused sallowness and melancholy. Too much blood brought red blotches. So women, especially among the nobility, were subjected to bloodletting not to cure illness, but to maintain their complexions. A cut behind the ear, a few ounces drained, and they were thought to glow with health. It was, quite literally, beauty drawn from suffering, and still the obsession grew. To soften the skin, women turned to natural oils, olive, almond, or goose fat mixed with beeswax. These were massaged into the face, especially before sleep, as it was believed that the night allowed the body to heal and renew. Some women slept with slices of cucumber or rose petals on their eyes to prevent puffiness. Others applied mashed figs or vinegar-soaked cloth to their faces to bleach freckles or dark spots. A remedy from 13th century France advised bathing the face in milk and honey every morning, then rinsing it in rainwater that had been collected during a full moon. These weren't just cosmetic tricks, they were acts of devotion. Because a woman's face was her temple. Every ritual, no matter how small or strange, was a prayer. A hope, a quiet promise that maybe tomorrow she would be lovely enough to be safe, to be loved, to be left alone. But beauty was not always gentle. In some parts of Europe, particularly in Germany and the Low Countries, women used a blend of arsenic and lime to lighten dark spots and scars. The mixture burned, it left the skin raw and red. But after healing, if healing came, it often revealed a lighter, smoother layer beneath. Of course, for many, the poison seeped deeper, causing nausea, nerve damage, and slow death. Still, they continued. And there were other poisons more insidious still. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was ground into powder and mixed into eye drops. A single drop widened the pupils, creating the doe-eyed look that poets raved about. But belladonna was, as its name warned, deadly. Prolonged use could cause blindness, hallucinations, even coma. And yet women used it carefully, secretly, because to be called beautiful was to be powerful, even if that power came at the cost of sight. In Spain, some noblewomen drank gold dust mixed into their wine, believing it gave the skin a radiant sheen. In Italy, crushed pearls were stirred into rose water and used as a facial tonic. In England, women drank warm ale mixed with herbs like yarrow, thyme, and wormwood, not for pleasure, but to purify the blood and improve the skin. Every part of the body was monitored, managed, sculpted. There was no space for imperfection, not in this world. And beauty wasn't just personal, it was political. In royal courts, queens were judged as much for their appearances as their policies. Some even wore small glass beads on strings around their necks, filled with dried herbs, basil, rosemary, and clove to mask body odor. And through it all, there was the mirror. Small, often made of polished metal or obsidian, later of blown Venetian glass, the medieval mirror was a sacred object. To look into it was not merely to see oneself, but to see one's soul. To evaluate not just the curve of a cheek or the color of a lip, but to ask, am I good enough, holy enough, safe enough? For them, beauty was not just an unreachable dream, it was a curse. In many villages, physical deformity was believed to be the mark of a sinful soul or worse, proof of witchcraft. A woman with a limp might be labeled possessed. A birthmark could be called a witch's teat. A hunched back might bring suspicion of devilry. These women were avoided, mocked, sometimes tortured. not for anything they had done, but for failing to meet a standard they never chose. Aging women suffered too. As the body changed, as skin sagged and hair thinned, society looked upon them with suspicion. No longer youthful, no longer marriageable, they were seen as burdens or worse, as dangerous. It was no coincidence that the stereotypical witch of medieval lore was always old, ugly, bent over with age. She was the opposite of beauty and therefore the opposite of good. So women concealed their age with herbs and tonics. They darkened their graying hair with walnut paste. They smoothed wrinkles with goose grease and powdered their faces with starch. Anything to hold on to the illusion, because to be old and female was to be vulnerable. And the tools of concealment were as elaborate as any weapon. In noble courts, women wore finely woven veils, not only as symbols of modesty, but to soften the light against their faces. In Italy, they wore thin strips of silk soaked in herbal tonics as masks while they slept. In France, beeswax tablets scented with clove and rose oil were pressed against the skin to extract impurities. In England, pearl powder was dusted across the face and décolletage before court appearances. The rituals were endless. They were repeated every day, often twice, 3 times, without fail. But the rituals were not just surface level. They shaped identity. A woman's ability to marry, to bear children, to be loved or accepted all were entangled with her appearance. A crooked nose might lead to mockery, a darkened tooth to gossip. Even laughter too loud, too unrefined could ruin a reputation. So she learned to sit still, to tilt her head just so, to speak only when spoken to smile without showing her teeth. These were not just gestures, they were survival skills. And what of the men? The truth is, men were not immune to the pull of beauty, but they were never judged by it the same way. A man might be ugly and still be noble, still be respected, still be powerful. In fact, many medieval kings were described as homely, rugged, even grotesque, but their strength and wealth made up for it. A woman, however, no matter how intelligent or noble or kind, was first and always judged by her face. Even the saints were not exempt. Biographies of saints described their beauty in poetic detail, skin like milk, eyes like stars, lips like rubies. And yet, many of these same women starved themselves, cut their hair, scarred their faces to escape the burden of desire. It was a cycle with no clear exit. To be beautiful was dangerous. To be unbeautiful was worse. And so she went on, day after day, brush in hand, mirror before her, applying the potions, combing the oils, reciting the prayers, knowing all the while that she would never be enough, because enough did not exist. It never had. And the answer was almost always the same: no, not yet. So she would go on plucking, painting, praying, hoping that tomorrow the mirror would finally show her someone worthy. As we journey deeper into the medieval world, we find that beauty was not one single standard, but 100 different interpretations, each shaped by geography, climate, belief, and fear. In the cold stone castles of northern Europe, paleness meant power. In the sun-soaked cities of southern Italy or Moorish Spain, beauty meant balance, olive skin kissed by light, deep-set eyes like polished agate, hair thick and glossy as polished chestnut. Here, too, the ideals were strict, but the tools were different: fragrant oils, black coal around the eyes, saffron rinses for hair, and face masks made from egg yolk and crushed almond shells. Across cultures, women endured variations of the same burdens: to be delicate, to be pure, to be desirable, but never too much, never threatening, never independent. In the Middle East and North Africa, ancient traditions carried forward into the medieval period emphasized ritual baths, perfumed skin, and intricate henna patterns on the hands and feet. Beauty was devotional here too, but also sensual, celebrated in poetry, song, and sacred stories. Women bathed in rose water, massaged their skin with date oil and black seed. They blackened their eyes with kohl, not only to appear alluring, but to protect against the evil eye, illness, and sun damage. Beauty was seen as a gift from God, but one that had to be protected, veiled, and often hidden. In Christian Europe, however, the balance tilted more severely. The Church taught that all earthly beauty was a shadow of divine perfection and therefore dangerous. A woman who was too beautiful could distract men from their path to salvation. Her hair, her scent, her skin, these were stumbling blocks. Temptations, Eve's legacy. So beauty was praised but policed, celebrated and condemned in the same breath. A woman might be adored for her eyes but lashed for using kohl. She might be admired for her figure, but accused of sin if she revealed too much shape beneath her gown. And still, they pursued it through pain, through secrecy, through whispered tradition. But what of those who could not chase these ideals? What of the women born with scars, birthmarks, twisted limbs, or faces marked by disease? The story of medieval beauty was not only etched onto women's bodies, it was painted in gold and lapis on parchment, carved in stone, woven into tapestries, and immortalized in stained glass. Art was both mirror and master, reflecting and dictating what women should be. Real mirrors, made of polished glass with a thin backing of silver, became more accessible, that it might, in some strange way, protect them from what was coming. As the medieval world began to crack under the weight of its own dogma, a new age stirred in its ashes. The Renaissance dawned with silk and science, with mirrors of Venice and pigments from distant shores. And with it came a transformation not just in art, but in the very idea of beauty. Suddenly, the human body was no longer a threat to the soul, but a reflection of divine geometry. Artists like Botticelli and Da Vinci painted women not as saints or warnings, but as muses, goddesses, flesh and blood made sacred. Beauty became not something to hide, but something to display. Skin glowed with warm tones. Lips were painted with crushed cherries. Hair was arranged in elaborate coils, jeweled and perfumed. The ideals shifted from severe and holy to sensual and soft, but the pressure remained. Because though the methods changed, the expectations did not. The face still had to be pale, but now with a livelier blush. The forehead still needed to be high, the figure delicate, the hands long and ivory pale. Now, however, beauty also demanded education. A beautiful woman must know poetry. She must be fluent in French. She must sing, embroider, and keep her voice light and agreeable. She must, in short, be perfect. Still. But as the age progressed, some women began to rebel not loudly, not violently, but quietly, subtly. They refused the plucking. They laughed with their mouths open. They darkened their hair instead of lightening it. They wore gowns that showed too much shoulder, painted their nails with crushed herbs, stared into mirrors without shame. Some wrote poetry mocking the beauty manuals. Others practiced medicine and passed down forbidden recipes, knowing full well the risk. They weren't saints or queens. Most of their names have been lost. But they left traces in recipes scratched into the margins of herbals, in portraits with mischievous smiles, in letters burned or buried. They were the first to ask, "What if I'm enough?" Of course, the world did not change overnight, not for them and not for us, because even now, centuries later, their stories are still ours. We no longer crush pearls into paste or pluck our foreheads to the bone or drink gold dust to brighten our skin, but we inject, we conceal. We filter and facetune and rearrange. We still sit before mirrors in quiet judgment. We still whisper the same questions they once did. Is this too much? Too little? Do I look good enough to be loved? To be safe? The ingredients are different. The pressure is not. And still the rituals remain, the creams in the cabinet, the way we smooth our faces before going out, the fear of aging, the hush that falls when someone walks into a room too plain or too bold, the way we punish women for being too beautiful or not beautiful enough. The contradiction is unchanged. But maybe now, knowing where it comes from, we can name it. We can see the ghost of the woman in the tower, sitting at her mirror, her fingers stained with powder, her heart beating in time with the church bell, wondering if today she be found worthy or condemned. We can hear her, even now, because she never really left. She lives in the powder compact, in the mirror, in the soft voice that still tells us we must improve. And maybe, just maybe, by remembering her, we can silence that voice, even for a moment, and say, she was enough. So, am I from the rut? From the grave? From the forgetting? Because in the end, that's what it all came down to. To be beautiful was to be remembered. To be plain was to be invisible. To be ugly was to be erased. At first, only the wealthy could afford them, but their influence was swift. Now, women could see themselves as others saw them. They could critique, adjust, compare. The mirror became an oracle, a judge, a silent tyrant that lived in every chamber. Some women were said to spend hours before them, adjusting their curls, reapplying rouge, perfecting the part in their hair. But others smashed them out of fear that they would see not beauty, but the devil. For in the folklore of the time, mirrors had power. They could capture a soul, reveal a demon, show a hidden truth. And as beauty rituals became more elaborate, the fear of their consequences grew. It was said that women who used too many powders might not be allowed into heaven, that artificial beauty faded faster in the grave, that vanity in life meant ugliness in the afterlife. Stories spread of women who were cursed for their pride, who died young or went mad or saw their faces melt before their very eyes. Whether real or imagined, these tales served a purpose: to control, to remind women that they could never fully own their bodies, that even their desire to be seen came with a price. And yet they persisted, even as the world crumbled around them, even as war and plague took their brothers, their children, their homes. Beauty rituals remained, perhaps because they were one of the few things a woman could control, a daily routine, a moment of stillness, a private world. Even if it was ruled by pain, it was hers. In plague years especially, when the air was thick with death and the skies turned red with omens, some women turned to beauty as a talisman. They believed that looking alive, healthy, vibrant, glowing might shield them from illness. Red cheeks, for example, were thought to repel disease. Some even painted circles of red on their cheeks and temples like armor against the Black Death. It didn't work, but what else was there to do? When medicine failed and prayers went unanswered, a painted face became the last act of hope. In medieval religious painting, the Virgin Mary was the eternal model, pale, long-limbed, serene, with golden hair and downcast eyes. She was the prototype of holiness, and artists rendered her with features that few real women ever possessed: flawless skin, the faintest rose on her cheeks, an almost supernatural lightness. Young women grew up staring at these faces in chapels, believing them to be divine truth. And so too did the sculptors of courtly tombs and cathedrals. Female effigies, carved from alabaster or marble, lay with hands folded and faces impossibly symmetrical. Even in death, women had to appear beautiful, composed, eternal. Their bodies, like their souls, were judged not just by the church or the king, but by the chisel, the brush, the eye of the sculptor who shaped them. But art also created impossible standards. It offered no room for deviation, no wrinkles, no scars, no fatigue. The woman in the painting never had pores, never lost sleep, never wept from exhaustion or bore the weight of 7 pregnancies. And the women who saw these images, noble or peasant alike, were meant to emulate them. A daily, lifelong audition for holiness. A canvas compared endlessly to a fantasy. And then there were the illustrated manuscripts, those delicate, hand-painted books made by monks in candlelit scriptoria. These too reinforced beauty myths: saints and noble women depicted with long necks, tapering fingers, impossibly white skin, and waistlines so narrow they seemed boneless. Even allegorical figures, justice, chastity, grace, were painted as women, and always beautiful, always flawless. As if goodness itself wore rouge and brushed its hair 100 times each night. But outside the illuminated world of art, superstition crept like a shadow. The further one traveled from the courts and monasteries, the deeper the fear surrounding beauty became. In rural villages, cosmetics were not just frowned upon, they were feared. A woman who wore too much face paint might be called a witch. Lip stain could be mistaken for a curse. A strong perfume might be thought to summon spirits. Some priests preached that painting one's face was akin to lying to God, that to hide your true appearance was to deceive not just men, but the heavens. And so, in some regions, women performed their beauty rituals in secret. They hid their powders in jars labeled for spices. They painted their cheeks by the firelight after the household slept. They whispered formulas to daughters but never wrote them down. Their knowledge passed mouth to ear, generation to generation, beneath a veil of fear. These recipes were never just about appearance. They were spells. They were protection. They were resistance against a world that never allowed them to be fully human. And yet the obsession only grew. The 14th and 15th centuries brought devastating plague, famine, and war, but they also brought mirrors. And in the quiet moments after burial, women would sit with their pots of rouge and powder, their rosewater and pearl dust, trying to believe that beauty could save them. But time, like beauty, never stands still.